Alright, let's talk about Alien Inferno's Fall by Philippa Ballantine. So I gotta make something clear here. The novel is written by Philippa Ballantine, but the story is also by Clara Correia, who seemed to be like a story group person for the Alien timeline now. She also seems to have a credit on Seventh Circle, which just came out back in January, and which is kind of a sequel to this. So let's talk about Inferno's Fall. This is once again another Free League RPG tie-in novel with a little scenario in the back. The scenario is that an engineer ship dumps black goo on a colony world, and you're supposed to survive the horrors that are created with the black goo. What is this novelization about? That kind of sort of that. So this is two-thirds a group called the Knot. They are a mining. They call themselves a mining collective. It's basically a family and some other people they've kind of adopted into their family. They're a multiracial family, but primarily Samoan and Chinese and like a few other races, but they all come from New Zealand. So now we're dealing with New Zealand politics a little bit. Like last book was British politics, before that American politics. So now we're dealing with New Zealand politics and dealing with the Union of Progressive Peoples, which is kind of barely dealt with in this. They're not really the focal point, unlike the previous two books that are very politics driven. This, we have the Knot, led by their matriarch Toru. She's pretty much our protagonist for this book. We also have Zula Hendrix is back with her daughter, which is an android that Davis created for her, that because he loved her, and it's weird. It's weird, and it doesn't really matter for most of this book because the Zula Hendrix plot is only like a third of this book, and that's being generous. It feels like more like a quarter of this book. Zula's older, and Zula doesn't do anything, so if you thought Zula was on this cover, you're wrong. Also, the Neomorphs or whatever from Alien Covenant, those aren't in the book either. In fact, there are no actual like standard xenomorphs either, which should be interesting if this book was written well in that regard. So this book is dealing with miners, not underage people, but like people that work in mines, and the haves and the have-nots once again. And I'm like, we've kind of been there, we've done that with this sort of story, and the Knot, ultimately, what it boils down to is we deal with some very unlikable people for most of this book, and it becomes very tedious. So it's primarily we're all stuck together, and we have to work together, but we hate one another kind of deal. And the Knot, like, people in the Knot keep dying. Spoilers, but I mean, it's an alien book, so you know that that's par for the course at this point. So we know the Knot's going to mostly not make it, no pun intended. But I just don't like them. Once again, we get another book that's really preachy on modern politics. Although, is it as bad as Colony War? No. And that seems to be the general consensus with this book, is at least it wasn't Colony War. And some people say this is good. I would argue it's not good. It's a good scenario ruined by modern day political writing. Although it's not as in your face as like the last two books were. I'm going to also put Into Cadris in here too, because Into Cadris is far more political than this book. It's still got too much politics for me to find it particularly likable. The protagonist Toru is knows what's best, always knows what's best, and it's just kind of an asshole about it, and like it's really annoying. Her whole family's annoying. There's way too many family members, which, I get it, like have a large family, but don't make them all like, it's really hard to figure out who's who. And then when they start dying, I can't remember who's who. All I remember is she had like either a daughter or a niece who had a wife, and then they had a shared husband at some point, but he's not in the book, which everyone like accepts as like a normal thing, and that made me laugh out loud because I guess thruples are acceptable in the future, even though we've never seen a thruple up until this point in an Alien book. But I guess that is normal, and we should be like, we should celebrate it. I don't know. It's weird. It's weird, and normally I don't point things out like that. I try not to because like I don't care typically, but the thruple, it's just so out of left field. It happens like in one chapter. It's brought up I think twice in that chapter, and then never brought up again. And it's weird. It's really weird, and it did make me laugh quite a bit. Um, so the I should talk about. I think her name's May, who's our synthetic, who's part of Zula's team. She's trying to figure out what her purpose is, and like, is she human or is she more than human? And like, she can inhabit other synthetic bodies. It's not very important to this plot. What it comes off as is sequel baiting, and Seventh Circle seems to deal with that, so I will not talk about that so much in this review because it just doesn't matter. Zula doesn't do anything really other than command a group of rogue colonial marines that are being hired by like this secret, not, I wouldn't say secret society, but just a group of like military people that are like worried about the things that happened in with into Cadris and Colony War, where they're like, the xenomorph needs to be exterminated. But herein lies the problem with Inferno's Fall. It relies too heavily on Colony War and into Cadris. In fact, I read this before reading those previous two books, and I did not understand things. There's a difference between like referencing things and then basing your book solely around that, and this borders lines on solely being based around these two, what I consider very badly written books. I get that we're trying to make a consistent continuity. I mean, Alien's been an IP for decades now, and now we're finally starting to do this thing again. I mean, I don't think they've tried since the early 90s to try to have a consistent continuity. So they're trying to make all the Titan books make sense, but it doesn't really work when there has been zero effort to try prior to this. I don't know. This book's tedious. I did not like reading it. I could see why people would prefer this over Colony War, because Colony War is like one of the worst books ever written in the history of ever. But this is pretty terrible and very predictable and just by the numbers bad. You would think with like new Black Goo, because it's really not an Alien book. I would call it a Prometheus book because it just deals with Black Goo. But you can't call it Prometheus because people don't like Prometheus, even though you had two successful Prometheus comics through Dark Horse that did fairly well. You could call this a Prometheus book. You really could, but they're not going to. The other thing is it ties into Isolation and Prometheus. There's a bunch of David androids and Working Joes, but they don't really do a whole lot. So, Anyway, better scenario than what was in Colony of War, but overall it just doesn't really work. It's just not that good. I give it a 2 out of 5. I wouldn't really recommend this one. What I would recommend is just reading the scenario out of the back of the book and playing it, because I think you'd have more fun making your own Free League or RPG campaign out of that. It's a fun scenario. So, anyway, have a nice day.